Good evening, everyone, and maybe good morning or afternoon to other people who are here. So thank you so much for having me here to talk with you a little bit. As Antonella mentioned, I am the co-founder of Just Ground. It's a human rights research and advocacy project. It's aimed at both trying to develop a more robust and rights-centered business and human rights field through a lot of research work, and also supporting rights holders in their efforts around stakeholder engagement and access to remedy. I spent a number of years working with Earth Rights International. It's a human rights and environmental organization. I was based in Washington, D.C. and in Southeast Asia. A large part of my work there involved working alongside community leaders in Myanmar as they designed and sought to negotiate a community-driven grievance mechanism. So sort of what you talked about yesterday, from a new approach, which we'll talk about more. I'm also a PhD researcher at the University of Galway, and I'm excited to have my supervisor joining us remotely. Hi, Sue. My research focuses on examining power, particularly discursive power and epistemic injustice in the context of seeking remedy through these types of grievance mechanisms. And as Antonella mentioned, I kind of giving my whole CV because I'm drawing on all of this for what we're talking about today. So before we begin, I wanted to sort of think, or have you think about, I spend a lot of time thinking about when we talk about rights holder involvement in remedy, this can happen at multiple levels. So we're spending most of today focusing on the idea of having rights holders, potential users of grievance mechanisms, communities involved in the design and the operation of these mechanisms. Rights holders can also be involved in issues of remedy kind of more broadly in kind of policy spaces, spaces like the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. It's a multi-stakeholder event that's held annually at the UN in Geneva. Spaces like the World Bank annual meetings, where in these spaces, rights holders have, in theory at least, have opportunities to contribute to policy and practice development. And this has come up often in the context of remedy. And actually, at the moment, I don't know if anyone follows what the World Bank does, but they are currently in a consultation process around a new remedy framework as we speak. So again, this is a space for rights holders to contribute to what might help change practice in terms of remedy. And then lastly, without getting like super meta about this, I think it's important to think about how rights holders, and in particular their lived experience and their knowledge, contributes to our social understanding of human rights, of what remedy is, about when it should happen, how it should happen, through what processes, kind of at a more societal level. And then moving on, I'm not sure how much of this you might have talked about yesterday, so I apologize in advance if I repeat anything that you all did talk about. But the question of why, like, why is it important to have people who are impacted by projects involved in shaping the remedy around it? I see it as kind of having two separate, potentially complementary arguments. The first is a more human rights-based argument. So, the right to remedy is a core, essential human right. And if you think about, if remedial institutions don't reflect the lived experiences of the people that might need to use these mechanisms, and or if these mechanisms don't function properly, then this prevents people from being able to exercise this right. The other argument is the business case argument, so that it makes business sense to involve rights holders in the design. The first argument is efficiency. So, imagine you're a company and you're designing a new product or service, and you actually want that to work. it would be in your interest to have as much interaction with potential users as possible. Like there's a whole user-centered design idea behind that. And so the same thing arguably applies here. Potential users of a grievance mechanism are uniquely positioned to know what the process should look like to be considered legitimate and accessible for them. It's also a way to, using the words of the UN Guiding Principles, which I think you talked about yesterday, to know and show your understanding of your responsibility to respect human rights as a company. And so by bringing rights holders in, you are showing that. The last argument that's used a lot is that by doing this, a company can improve the relationship with the impacted community, and that this could kind of give them more social license to operate. I put an asterisk there just because I think while that can be true in some cases, the argument is from a human rights perspective can be a little problematic sometimes. So you may have talked about sort of the development of the UNGPs and the ideas of kind of the utility of non-judicial grievance mechanisms. So I want to step back to that just briefly to sort of think about how the understanding of engagement and rights holder involvement evolved. In the early days, when this was sort of just being discussed, there was a lot of conversation around the importance of having potential users, having the rights holders involved in these mechanisms. However, I would note, to my knowledge, the rights holders themselves were not actually part of these conversations. It was kind of more talked about than talked with. However, the intentions were good. But if you notice, and what you probably saw yesterday, under 2011, the quote pulled from the UNGPs themselves, the language changed. It got watered down. It got quite vague. And so it went from having this very kind of concrete and practical guidance about jointly designing and overseeing. You have this based on engagement, have consultations. That raises a number of questions about why that happened, but also then what does that mean in terms of the broader understanding of what they mean by engagement and how that's applied? So when I think about that question, I think about sort of three overlapping and multi-layered questions that I think are important for thinking about engagement, because the answers to these questions influence what's possible within the engagement and what might come out of them. The first one is like the purpose. So why do we have these? Why do we all sit down together at this dialogue table? Is it for a company to give information to a community, to tell them about a project, to tell them about the grievance mechanism that they're putting together? Is it for them to take information from the community, to get some opinions from them? Or is it to have a conversation and kind of have a dialogue, a back and forth about this? Relatedly, then, kind of what are the expectations? What do you see coming out of this? Is it a way for you as a company to put in your public reporting, oh yeah, we did our due diligence, we did X many consultations? Or is it to shape and adapt your mechanism based on what you learn in these conversations? And in thinking about that, thinking critically about who decides what the purpose is, and what challenges might happen if the parties coming in have different expectations of the outcome. So then relatedly is a question about parameters, which other people have used language like the rules or the boundaries of the engagement. Sort of what is the agenda set up in advance? Are there certain topics, certain issues that have to be talked about, that should be talked about, or that cannot be talked about? This can also cover styles of communication. Is this engagement formal? Like, what's the level of formality? What is the level of emotionality that's allowed? Do you have to be, stone-faced and rational, or can you be emotional in that? And then again, thinking about when are those decided? When are those rules decided? Who decides them? And so for the two questions for me, I don't know if anyone has law backgrounds, but it makes me think about law school. We were doing contract law, and there's this idea of meeting of the minds, so that a contract is only valid when both parties going in have the same understanding of the contract itself, of the terms in the contract. And this could, something similar might play out in this context. To give you one example from the UN Forum this year, the multi-stakeholder event that I mentioned before, there was a lot of conversation in almost every single session on collaboration and coming together to find solutions. Everybody was talking about it, which sounds great, right? But if you listened, and like, you didn't even have to listen that closely, you could see that different people, states, private sector, civil society, rights holders, were talking about different things. So that kind of relates to potentially different understandings. The last kind of related question is how rights holders are perceived in these engagement spaces. Are they considered sources of information, or are they considered participants? Do they have agency? Do they have decision-making authority? And so in my experience and my observations of experiences with other people that I've worked alongside in various networks, and this is also reflected in the literature. The purpose of engagement, if it happens at all, is most often giving information. A company giving information to a community, to a group of rights holders. Sometimes there will be receiving information, sort of an idea of giving them an opportunity to have their voice heard, although nothing is actually done with that information. Okay, well, thank you for telling us that, and we'll go on and do what we were going to do. The parameters around this, there's a tendency to kind of shy away from strong language with grievance mechanisms, despite the fact that the UNGPs themselves talk about grievance mechanisms and talk about remedy. They're often kind of different languages used. So people aren't comfortable using the word grievance or the word remedy because it sounds too much like it's, assuming guilt, is too punitive. So what happens then is that you have kind of more gentle language that makes it more difficult for rights holders to have the language to be able to accurately explain their harms and what they want from that in terms of getting remedy. Related to that, in terms of kind of parameters, is that there is, and this has been highly critiqued from the beginning, is that the approach to remedy through non-judicial grievance mechanisms is sort of advocated as being dialogue-based, as this idea of coming together to find solutions, creating win-win situations that everyone's happy with. And again, while this can be the case in certain circumstances, it can also be very, very different. And in those situations, this idea is actually a misrepresentation of the reality. For example, you have two parties. You have a company and you have a community, and the company is already well positioned, and they can stand to profit from a project. Whereas on the other side, you have a community that's been harmed that ends up worse off. And so for them, they're just trying to get back up to some semblance of a dignified life that they had before. So to frame that as win-win in certain situations can be problematic and potentially harmful. The last point on this is the perception of rights holders. There is a tendency for those providing remedy to be very skeptical, and they sort of see, oh, well, as soon as people know that we're going to be providing remedy, it's going to open these floodgates, and all of these greedy rights holders are going to come and they're going to try to take as much as they can from us, which is not in any way the reality of the situation. But what this does is it forces people seeking remedy to have to constantly be revalidating their harms and convincing the other parties over and over again that the harm actually happened, that it's actually as bad as they say it is. There's also a lot of prejudice or deflated credibility, I would say, against rights holders for various types of identity prejudices, racism, indigenous status, education level. I mean, to offer one example from my work a long time ago, they were talking with one of the representatives, one of the project stakeholders, and said, well, you need to follow your guidelines. You have these social environmental guidelines. You have to follow them in your project. And she kind of just rolled her eyes at them and said, oh, yeah, really? Which one? Do you even know them? So there is a tendency to sort of assume a lack of intelligence with people. The last one is stigmatization. So, when you're approaching remedy through this dialogue, coming together to find solutions, and rights holders instead try to approach it through a more rights claiming approach, they end up stigmatized. And they are labeled anti-development. They are labeled adversarial, confrontational, antagonistic. And what can happen on the sort of less scary side of that means that maybe they're not invited to participate anymore, or maybe they're not listened to with care. But on the other side, that could also result in reprisals. People who challenge development projects, people who raise claims about harms that they've suffered, put themselves at great risk. Risks to human rights defenders is increasing every year. There are hundreds of people killed for doing exactly what rights holders do when they're seeking remedy. So kind of given all of this dire situation, a new approach is needed. And this, when we started working on this at Earth Rights back in like 2013, it was, based on this understanding that we're not necessarily championing grievance mechanisms as a wonderful solution, or not, kind of taking a neutral position on that, but just acknowledging that they are becoming more common, and that there is a really big risk of bad mechanisms kind of becoming good practice. And just the reality that they are sometimes the only option available to people. I won't spend time just kind of going through the details of this. This is just to show that I'm not alone, or we weren't alone in sort of thinking that we need a better approach, both to engagement more broadly, and also to remedy. I mean, these arguments have been made by rights holders themselves since they've ever had engagement practices. I put up a couple examples from the last two UN forums, and there's a quote there that you saw from the reading, which hopefully you read. This is also comes up in scholarship more and more. There's not a lot on the issue of stakeholder engagement in the context of remedy through these mechanisms specifically, but you can find it in scholarship on grievance mechanisms, and also on stakeholder engagement. It'll come up in a lot of like political CSR scholarship, kind of echoing this need to reorient the approach. And it seems like it resonated, at least in theory, with kind of policymakers, human rights bodies, There is changing language, maybe a shifting in the discourse, hopefully. In 2017, there was, I think it's a pretty good report that came out by the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And one of the focuses of this report was this idea of putting rights holders at the center of everything around remedy and accountability. A couple years later, in 2019 and 2020, two separate reports came out, one by the International Commission of Jurists on operational level grievance mechanisms, the second from the OHCHR as part of an accountability and remedy project. And both of them recommended this idea of co-design of grievance mechanisms, or when possible, community-driven. And I would just note on the community-driven part, this was informed in part by the work of the community that I was working with. So the community-driven operational grievance mechanism, which is way too much of a mouthful, so we say CDOGM to make it a little bit faster. It builds on a long history of rights holder centered approaches to identifying impacts and remedying impacts. So we're sort of, I consider it sort of, standing on the shoulders of giants in some ways. So what is it in general? So I don't know how much you talked yesterday about what grievance mechanisms are, but sort of the current model being a company creates a mechanism to address harms arising from their projects. And if they are aligning with the UNGPs, then they go to the impacted community and get their input on this grievance mechanism. So what a CDOGM does is it kind of flips the script on that. So instead of the company going into a community to get their feedback on something that the company had created, or a company coming in to say, work together with us within this framework that we've already set, it's the community, the rights holders, that create the first draft, that say what they want this mechanism to look like, and then they go to the company to negotiate it. So it kind of does it in reverse. And of course, ultimately, both parties have to agree to it. The company has to agree in order for it to actually happen. But by doing this kind of the other way around, it enables rights holders to be able to articulate what they want in a grievance mechanism in their terms and on their terms.
Of course, sorry, if anything is unclear, please raise your hand.
Yes, please do. I meant to say that at the very beginning. Please jump in. Also, if I talk too fast, tell me to slow down. I have a tendency to do that sometimes when I get excited, especially. So with the grievance mechanism as well, it covers both process and outcomes. So they will design kind of what they want the mechanism to look like, and they will also think about how to make sure that it actually operates well. Because one of the biggest problems at the moment with existing grievance mechanisms, if they exist, is that while they might be getting more, nice looking on paper, they're not giving remedy. So there's a lot of problems with actual implementation of them. So really quickly before I talk about the draft grievance mechanism that we were working on, just a couple quick points. So even if a grievance mechanism is designed by a community, it serves a strategic but not like a central place in what people talk about as the remedy landscape. So it should never get in the way of a rights holder's ability to seek remedy through something else, especially court. On sort of the co-design versus community-driven idea, a community-driven could very likely be co-designed, but it's not required to. That would be a decision for the community whether whether and to what extent they want to collaborate on the design and the management. With the co-management, I think the same thing applies, but it is probably more likely that it will be co-managed in that companies have a responsibility to participate in these mechanisms. And then the last quick point is just that while this is a potentially really useful option, it's not the best option in every situation. For example, if a community is actively opposing a project. So before we begin, I wanted to show you a quick video. It's only like 5 or 6 minutes. This should give you a little bit of background on where we designed the grievance mechanism and why. I also, because I wanted to apologize in advance, I usually prefer to have more pictures in my presentations, but especially in talking about Siloa, the political situation right now is just really sensitive, and I wanted, out of an abundance of caution, to prioritize their safety. So I didn't include photos. This video, however, it's available online, but I also got permission from Ekai Nguyen is the name of the guy who's going to be talking most in this video. And he's one of the community leaders that was involved in the design of this grievance mechanism. So hopefully, if I click on the link, it will show the video.
Tilwa athu siwa yi so yi po ကျွန်တော်တို့ဒေသမှာအခုလိုပေါ်ပေါက်လာတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့ကျွန်တော်တို့မြင်ပါတယ်နံပါတ်1ခုနကအပိုင်းကအနေနဲ့အစိတ်ပိုင်းတစ်ခုခါတာ400လေးတစ်ခုလောက်လိုက်တဲ့နေရာမှာဒီရဲ့ဒေသခံတွေရဲ့အကျိုးစီးပွားတွေဒေသခံတွေရဲ့အခွင့်အရေးကိုချိုးဖောက်ခံနေရတဲ့ထက်ကဒါတွေကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီအချိန်မှာမနှဲကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီကြားတွေကနေပြီးတော့လိုက်ပြီးတော့အတက်နိုင်ဆုံးပြောင်းလဲမှုတစ်ခုဖြစ်အောင်လုပ်နေတဲ့အချိန်မှာအထူးစီးပွားရေးဆိုဘယ်တော့မှမတိုက်ခိုက်ဘူးမရက်တန့်ခိုင်းဘူးမဖြတ်စည်းဘူးကျွန်တော်ဒါဒီဖြစ်တဲ့နဲ့ဖြစ်ဖို့လို့လိုတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့အထူးစီးပွားရေးဆိုမြန်မာနိုင်ငံတော်ဖွံ့ဖြိုးနေတိုင်းမှာအထူးစီးပွားရေးဆိုဖွံ့ဖြိုးနေတာနဲ့ဒီနိုင်ငံရဲ့ကျွန်တော်တို့ဒေသကတီလိုဝါဒေသကခုနပြောလို့လူတွေရဲ့အကျိုးစီးပွားလည်းဖွံ့ဖြိုးဖို့လို့လိုတယ်ဒီတီလိုဝါအထူးစီးပွားရေးဆိုပြီးတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့2013ပေါ့ဗျာ2013ဇန်နဝါရီမှာစပြီးတော့ notice ကတ်လိုက်တယ်ပေါ့ notice ကတ်တော့ဒီနေရာမှာ1996-99မှာပြတ်ခဲ့တဲ့စီမံကိန်းပြန်ပြီးတော့စမှာလားပေါ့ဆိုတာကျွန်တော်တို့ပြန်ပြီးတော့ဒီနေရာကနေပြီးတော့အထူးစီးပွားရေးဇုံဒီမှာတည်မယ်2013ဇန်နဝါရီမှာကျွန်တော်တို့အိမ်တွေကို notice စကတ်တယ်14ရက်တော့ဒီမှာကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီနေရာကနေပြီးတော့ထောက်ခါပေးရမယ်ဖယ်ပေးရမယ်ဖယ်မပေးနိုင်လို့ရှိရင်တရားမထောင်မှာရက်ပေါင်း30ကြာခန့်လေးဆိုရဲ notice အိမ်ကိုလာကတ်တော့မှာကျွန်တော်တို့ဒီနေရာမှာတီလို့အထူးစီးပွားရေးဇုံပြန်ပြီးတော့တည်ဆောက်မယ်ဆိုတာကိုကျွန်တော်တို့သိရတယ်ဗျာဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်ပထမဆုံးစပြီးပြောင်းလာတဲ့အချိန်မှာဆိုလို့ရှိရင်မိုးတွင်းဘက်မှာဒီနေရာတွေအကုန်လုံးကရေတအားကြီးတယ်ရေနစ်တယ်ကျွန်တော်ဒီအခုလက်နှိပ်တုံဝင်နေစပြီးတော့တူးထားတယ်အဲ့လက်နှိပ်တုံဝင်နေဆိုစတူးတဲ့အချိန်တုန်းကရေနှိပ်လိုက်ရေကအဝါပဲပါတယ်ဒီနှိပ်တဲဝါရေအဲ့ဟိုဒီလိုစပြောင်းလာတဲ့ဟိုကနေရိပ်မရှိတဲ့အကွင်းထီးကြီးထဲမှာကျွန်တော်တို့ခုအချိန်ထိလေပူတိုက်တယ်နေပူခံရတယ်ဒါတွေကတော့ဒါမဲ့အဆိုးဆုံးဒီကလူတွေရဲ့ခုနပြောသလိုပဲကျွန်တော်ရှင်းမှပြောခဲ့တဲ့မြေကြီးပေါ်ကနေအတက်မိုးချောင်းပြုနေတဲ့လူတွေရုပ်တရက်ဒီမြေကြီးကိုဆုံးရှုံးလိုက်ရတဲ့အခါမှာသူတို့အစားထိုးပူလာနေရပါတယ်လို့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကခုနပြော2014ခုနှစ်မှာဂျွန်9ရက်နေ့ဂျွန်9ရက်မှာကျွန်တော်တို့ဂျပန်ကိုတွားခဲ့တိုကျိုကိုတွားခဲ့အဲ့ဒါဂျိုက်ကာဒီသူ့ရဲ့ guideline တွေနဲ့ကိုက်ညီမှုမရှိဘူးလိုက်နာမှုမရှိဘူးဆိုတာကိုကျွန်တော်တို့တွေ့ရတယ်ပေါ့အဲ့တော့တိုကျိုမြို့မှာကျွန်တော်တို့ဂျပန်ရဲ့ဂျိုက်ကာရဲ့စုံစမ်းစစ်ဆေးဥက္ကဋ္ဌကိုကျွန်တော်တို့တွားပို့ခဲ့တယ်စုံစမ်းစစ်ဆေးရဲ့ဥက္ကဋ္ဌကိုတွားပို့ခဲ့တယ်ဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်ကဂျပန်ကိုတွားတော့ကျွန်တော်တခါပြောခဲ့ဘူးလေဗျာမင်းတို့တစ်ပတ်လည်းပဲလာနေကြီးပေါ့ကျွန်တော်ဂျပန်မှာပြောခဲ့တာမျိုးရှိတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာခြိုက်ကာကိုကျွန်တော်သွားတော့ပြောခဲ့တာမျိုးရှိတယ်အရင်အဲ့လိုဒဏ်တွေကိုခံစားရတယ် 2015 ခုနှစ်နိုဝင်ဘာ 14 မှာကျွန်တော်ဂျနီဗာခရီးစဉ်တစ်ခုသွားခဲ့တယ်ပေါ့။သွားခဲ့တဲ့ရေကြောင့်ကျွန်တော် UN ကိုအစည်းအဝေးသွားတက်တယ်။နိုင်ငံတကာအစိုးရအဖွဲ့အစည်းတွေကိုတည်သိနေတယ်။ဒီလိုဟာတွေကိုကျွန်တော်ချိုးဖောက်ခံနေရတဲ့တီလိုဟာဒေသခံတွေရဲ့အခွင့်အရေးအကျိုးစီးပွားတွေကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ကာကွယ်နိုင်ဖို့လို့ကျွန်တော်တို့ဒေသခံတွေစူးစမ်းနေတာဒီ CGOGN ကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ဒေသခံတွေဒီအချိန်မှာစူးစမ်းနေတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့ကျွန်တော်ရဲ့ယုံကြည်ချက်ဒီ CGOGN တခုဖြစ်လာခဲ့မယ်ဆိုရင်စီမံနဲ့အကောင့်ထဲပေါ်နေတဲ့သူတွေအစိုးရအဖွဲ့အစည်းတွေကရင်းနှီးမြှုပ်နှံတဲ့သူတွေဒေသခံကိုယ်စားလှယ်တွေဒေသခံတွေရဲ့ဂျားထဲမှာအများကြီးကိုပြောလို့အပြုသဘောဆောင်တဲ့ပေါင်းစပ်မှုတွေရင်းနှီးမှုတွေကိုအများကြီးရလာနိုင်တယ်ဆိုတဲ့ဟာကိုဒါကျွန်တော်ရည်ရွယ်ချက်ကောင်းကောင်းနဲ့ဘယ်လိုပဲစိန်ခေါ်မှုတွေကြုံလာလို့ရှိနေကြတယ်နောက်တစ်ခုကကဘာပေါ်မှာရှိတဲ့အစိုးရအတိုင်းကဘာပေါ်ကယင်းနှိမ့်မြုပ်နှံသူတိုင်းဒေသခံတွေရဲ့အခွင့်အရေးတွေကိုလေးစားစေခြင်းဒေသခံတွေရဲ့အတန်ကိုနားထောင်ပေးစေခြင်းဒါဒီစီမံကိန်းလုပ်တဲ့နေရာမှာအောင်မြင်မှုတစ်ခုလို့ပဲကျွန်တော်မြင်တယ်
It may seem like a little bit unfair what I will say now, but like in my opinion, maybe like I am too orthodox on these things, you know. But like since all these projects that affected the local people, we have seen not only Myanmar but also in other seminars that we did here. Like it seems to me, in my opinion, like as a student who are specialized also in economic growth in history, it seems to me like that all these projects that are affecting people, the local people, are the result not of the profit maximization of giant firm, but it's rather the result of the lack of institutional organization and institutional power of the country. That's like not something that's we acquire in a day. It's a long process that we are experiencing, we as the Western world are experiencing for about 200 years. Because I do think that even 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, also in the Western part of the world, there were all these projects that were affecting the local people. So like, but the institutional organization evolved with this problem in order to adapt and like challenge this problem. That is an issue that all those countries haven't done yet. So like my point is, it is like a point of view of struggling and like complaining about the firm, or it could be better the point of complaining about the lack of institutional power of the country. Because like there are two different things. You know, everyone wants the development of this country, and everyone wants that the welfare of the people increase. But how can you increase the welfare for future generation, like in this case, for increasing the productivity of the area and so on, without harming the generation that are currently living in that place? It may seem odd, and like it may seem also unethical what I say, but it's like a normal process of evolving of countries that can last a lot of time.
I think you raise,
Sorry for this one.
no, not at all. No, I'm glad that you brought that up because you actually raise a number of bigger, broader questions, some of which I look at and I think about in my subsequent research, because we might have different opinions about the historical evolution of the corporate form and the development of countries and how ideas of development have been thought about and then enacted on people and on countries. But you do raise a critically important issue, and this is absolutely to say that this is not sort of confined just to a corporation. It does fit within this bigger context of, in particular in Myanmar, because this was happening at a time when the country was coming out of a dictatorship, and so there was a priority there for development. As soon as the country started to open up, investment started flooding in, and this was actually one of the reasons that we that the grievance mechanism approach we thought might work, because we were thinking that maybe there's a possibility that investment, the way that countries or companies, in this case, it's a public-private partnership between companies and governments in Japan and Myanmar, but how business operates in a way that's different than it has historically been and more in line with human rights. It didn't actually work out that way. I think there's other, I won't get into too many details because I didn't prepare really thoughtful notes on it. But there are also a lot of issues right now with corporate influence over states. I mean, there's an entire focus area on the corporate capture of governments, of the UN itself, and the ability, the ways that they exercise power in order to sort of make sure that they still benefit in these processes of states sort of trying to develop themselves. And that's, I guess, in another way, not to get too much off the point, but that's another reason why it's difficult for people, you know, how I mentioned before, when people get stigmatized when they complain about a project and they get labeled as anti-development. And they're not, they're just saying, look, what we want development to be is social development, not only economic development. So yeah, I mean, so I take her point, and I wish I had another session to.
Yeah, it's like, I think that's if there is a project in Sweden or in Norway or in Germany, like in Europe in general, I don't think that the priorities would be only of profit maximizing, but also to like address the problem of the locals. But in those areas that are struggling and they are thrilled to welcome investments from abroad, I think that there is little to do, but from the point of view of an European well-being guy with respect to someone that is looking for richness. You know?
Okay, if I may add to this discussion, because I know, of course, this approach. So to me, it's what sometimes economists struggle to see and understand with this discussion is the notion that firms in contexts where there are evident governance gaps, where there are institutional weaknesses, which is, by the way, 70% of the world or even more, okay? In such places, when they go there and operate, that doesn't mean that they necessarily, and this is sometimes too easily taken for granted, need to do harm to the local people and the ecosystems in order for their operations to be viable, okay? So sometimes it is like easily assumed that, okay, you go there, it's poor institutions, it's poor people, there's nothing, there's no protection, there's no rule of law. How do you do business without devastating the local ecosystem? Well, yes, I mean, I can understand this kind of critiques, but it's not necessarily the case that you have to do business in this way. In fact, you can't, the point is avoiding that. It means you go in a place and if there is a local community there and you expect to do a big, giant infrastructure, which is good for some other portions of development processes, and then you have these people, and perhaps there are ways in which you can deal with them, trying to avoid that to take all the water away from them. You can still build your infrastructure, but you can still safeguard the water access. Or maybe if they need to be displaced, you have to interact with them and see, okay, what are the strategies for displacing these people, okay, these communities, let's say, or other alternatives. So the point is that very often you say, okay, they go there, they devastate the environment, what else? I mean, it's a government fault, they need to develop. But no, I mean, you can go there, but still be respectful of rights. And this is, this line is where we need to focus.
This is the reason why we are taking this.
Well, this is the reason why there is this course, but also this is the reason why this is the area where there is so much misunderstanding. And it's like let's say a black box there. Say, okay, we need there, and of course we contaminate. It's an oil industry, okay, but there are ways in which you devastate for 3 generations an entire ecosystem, and there are ways in which you can mitigate those effects, or you can generate opportunities for grievance and remedies that are not something that companies have contemplated for many years, but now are starting to contemplate. And why shouldn't we ask companies to do those? So they don't go bankrupt. That's the other thing that we take for granted as economists, that if you invest more in respecting people, then you go bankrupt, but that's not the case in many, especially large-scale companies. So really, we have to unlearn, borrowing that science word, but also others. I mean, sometimes we have to avoid taking for granted some axioms that we have learned, and then we rediscuss them, because there are spaces in which can improve and respect human rights while also contribute to economic growth. So that is where we need to discuss and understand that. Yes, I mean, sorry to jump in, but
No,
sometimes I
dialogue is great.
that from the economic, because I'm also an economist, or at least let's say a halfway economist and a management scholar, so I see where these comments come from, and I can understand the rationale, but sometimes it's we have been taken for granted certain assumptions for too long. Mm-hmm. And so this course is actually opening up a little bit of this black box.
The orthodox ideas.
Well, the orthodox ideas, but even this is very far away from orthodox, this course, but even
the fact what we learn during the standard
I know.
It's not orthodox, and you know better than me.
Yeah, I know. So sorry, I mean,
please, no, yes, absolutely.
Okay, I think maybe I'm just a little more pessimistic, because I feel like the pure fact that grievance mechanisms exist is like proof for that, like, companies are not respecting human rights in other countries. So there's so many complaints and there's so much struggle that they implement these mechanisms. And then we already heard that in most cases, no remedy is paid. So I don't really see how it's like the wish of the company to do better business. It's just, I feel like when I read the papers, I felt like it's mostly an image thing.
Okay, that's on you.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, if you want to pick up, I mean, I could answer that, but perhaps you're more the expert than me, and you had another question.
I want to reply to, and then I have a question.
Sure.
Let's go. From Rome.
I get to the point that there is this natural process of making mistakes, learning that, but I don't know if someone is trying to build the first wheel, and you know that the right way to do it is around. You can tell them the better way, the efficient, the less damaging ways make it round. You avoid people to make mistakes for a long time, squared or hexagonal, and no. The same for the firms against the government. It can avoid, I don't know, hundreds of years of.
It was in fact like my point, like rather to complain against the firm, it should teach the government and the institution
Yeah, but
how to do
complaining
things
is
properly.
the first step. I mean, you have to let them know what's wrong, because maybe they think, oh, everything's all right. I have my slaves and everything go on. So first we pass the information, and then they can go to the process, and then finally get to the remedy. And
Is it in the interest of the government to learn? This is a very big question in my opinion.
well,
Is it in their interest? Because
Yeah.
you can teach to do it around the wheel, but is it in their interest to learn and to do it around?
theoretically, yes, because if we are further in this process, we get that it is okay to go that way.
Maybe we can ask Katherine, I mean, what was your question?
Yeah. It's also related with what we discussed yesterday, that as we have seen in the video, that there is a big distance sometimes between the organization and then the locals, also for firms, as we said yesterday. So what could be a way of reducing this distance? I mean, as the local said, you should come to our house and live there. So it represents the feeling that they are really far away from the people who with the suits that makes big decisions. So what would be a way of do it actually, and also make people feel that way? Because sometimes it could be that there is no big distance, but the feelings around is not there. So,
All right. So I'm going to try to address all of them, but if I miss one thing, I had responses to everyone, but I hope I remembered them all. I didn't bring my notebook in front of me. So on this, so part of my research actually touches on some of these topics about how corporations create and reproduce certain discourses that kind of then reproduce assumptions about practice. And one of the narratives that is often used that I see in practice all the time is this shifting it back to the government. Like, why are you blaming us? We came into this and we just want to do business, and we're suddenly expected to do more, and it's the government's fault, which is, in my opinion, very disingenuous. And this, I can't talk in detail because it's kind of in the middle of my research focus on sort of specifically what they're doing. But some examples from practice is that they benefit from these types of situations. And in some cases, they actually impede a government's ability to protect the rights of their own citizens. So there are investment agreements between states and companies. And if there's an investment agreement about a project, and then the government puts in place new environmental protections or new laws that would protect their citizens better, ensure better investment, the company can and has and is often successful in suing the state. So they do make it difficult, in addition to sort of the this leverage, which is based on, you know, if we want to get into like the history of imperialism and colonialism, but why states are in different places in what we talk about as developed, if they're underdeveloped, and why sort of where that comes from. But yeah, so anyway, I don't want to ramble too much, but there are specific narratives that the companies often use about that argument. Say, well, we're not to blame. But like you were saying, it is absolutely true. And I think you kind of said it in a way too. Like, if you go into an affluent area, you're going to do the project carefully. So you have the ability, like a company has the ability to do a project and actually mitigate the harms, whether they decide to or not. And it's not also like, this is also not to say that every single time a company comes in, they're doing it with the intent to hurt someone, or like it's only because we care about profit. It's sometimes, it's often, like you're saying, kind of a PR strategy, definitely. But it's also they're reproducing a discourse that they came into, that they didn't create it, but they're reproducing it. Like they see development as economic development. They see things within sort of a narrow vision. And this is actually why I would definitely recommend to look at some of the literature around epistemic injustice and kind of cognitive justice, because that does sort of explain that there are people who are trying to change those discourses, and they get kind of pushed to the side and say, no, this is the traditional way of learning it. And, kind of what you're talking about, getting outside the box and reorienting things. That's one way that I think is a useful way to do it. It's sad to say that I share your pessimism. It's just been, it's been the practice. I hope that it can change. I am arguing in my research that by critically examining the practices, then we can figure out where certain places certain practices where things are shaping problems, so that we can try to fix them. So it's still really difficult, but it's not to say that it can't get better. Remain cautiously optimistic, I guess. And on the question of sort of bridging that gap, I think it's a great question. And to me, it's more of a question of the approach to how you engage with those people, and not necessarily the access to it. So, for example, this in Tiloa, JICA, one of the investor bank, had a team. They had their technical expert team, JICA's expert team, they were called. So they had people there all the time, and they hired someone local who had actually previously worked for a civil society organization. They brought them on. But the problem, so there's a couple different types of problems. One is that just because you go into the community doesn't mean you're going to be trusted. It doesn't mean you're going to be in contact with the right people. You may come in there, because there are all of these different power dynamics at play. People might feel like they have to be nice to you and not really tell you the truth. People might want to get something out of it, so they will tell you the truth. What can also happen, and this I think I had talked about later in the presentation, what companies can and often do is they invest in like local community resource people, but they can sort of cherry pick who they talk to. And so they can say, oh, well, we engaged with the people who agreed with us. And we sort of didn't talk as much to the people that questioned us more, or that, were a little bit more confrontational with us. So to me, the shift that's needed, and a couple of things. One is that they need to do more in that. They need to be more present, but they also need to make sure that the people that are going into that are properly trained and have the soft skills necessary to engage with humility and with, and an open mind and a willingness to actually listen. So that's sort of what I would say would help marginally.
Yeah, I'm a little cautious about
Fine.
time. So yeah,
Yeah.
15 minutes more because we have to discuss it.
Okay, awesome, cool. So I will go through these quickly. So I think you caught this most of this from the video about sort of the context for why this happened. Harms were happening, people were not getting remedy. And so the first thing that we did, because I was at Earth Rights at the time, and we were already working with this community, trying to help them get remedy through lots of different channels. It wasn't working. So we started to have conversations about whether they wanted to try a CDOGM. And I'm mentioning this because it's something that like you should never force it on someone. We had a lot of very open, honest conversations about what might be possible and not, and whether they actually wanted to do it or not. And they did. They really wanted to. So we did it. They elected a small group, which they called the Design Committee. They took the lead in these workshops and meetings that we had over the course of a couple of years. And these covered like a wide variety of topics. Some were focused on the mechanism itself. What is it going to look like? How is it going to operate? Who's going to operate it? There was a lot of thought put into how to make sure that the rest of the community feels like it represents their interests, that they feel comfortable giving their input, participating, joining the design committee if they want to, that there were separate workshops and meetings for more traditionally marginalized groups. Some of the leaders from the design committee ended up also setting up a women's group in Zilua. They made all of their materials available in both of the languages spoken in the area. And then the last kind of set of workshops involved the advocacy around it, like how do we get the project developer? So as I said, it was a public-private partnership. So the project developer was sort of officially the main decision maker. But they really needed buy-in from everybody and how to get that. I won't talk about this in detail because Ekan Win mentioned much of this in the video. They advocated for the CDOGM in many different forums. They had direct meetings with all of the different project stakeholders, with JICA, with the project developer, with the regional government, the SEZ management committee. For 18 months, they were part of a multi-stakeholder dialogue. And actually in there, they had negotiated an interim mechanism, like a smaller version to deal with immediate harms, which unfortunately never happened. And then they presented at the UN twice. So Ekan Win went in 2015, and another community leader went in 2017. So the end of 2016, they had a draft. This is a visual representation of it. If you're interested in reading it, there is an English version available on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center's website. It's about 9 pages, maybe. I think it's really comprehensive, and I think it's actually a very diplomatic and collaborative focused. It proposes co-management. It has a lot of, if you see, all of the green is oversight processes, and all of the purple is feedback collection from the broader community. So this draft was shared with all of the project stakeholders to get their feedback to come to a negotiation on a final draft. This happened from the end of 2016 through 2017. Which is when things, unfortunately, took a bad turn. So as I said, they spoke, we all spoke actually at the UN in 2017. And right after we all got, including the company stakeholders and the government and everyone. So right after that panel was organized, and without telling the design committee, the project developer decided instead of engaging on this mechanism that had already been drafted, that they would hire a consultant to create a totally different one. And we only learned about it shortly before. Yeah, so it was unfortunate. But that is my main question. And that is actually what prompted my research, because, you know, it doesn't make sense to me. Like in many ways, this should have been like an ideal situation. You know, you have, you're developing a project, the community largely did not oppose the project. The community actively sought dialogue. I mean, and to be fair, there were times where there was a more campaign angle to some of the advocacy, which was often the result of frustration around, the fact that 10 years later, they still haven't gotten remedy. But for the most part, they tried to have constructive dialogue. And, they proposed something that was not that didn't push any company actors out. It was collaborative in its management, the proposed draft. And also, especially by that point, by 2017, all of the actors were well versed in the UNGPs. A lot of them had committed to the UNGPs. There were other organizations in Myanmar, for example, the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business, who had organized that dialogue table. So they had all of these workshops on stakeholder engagement, on grievance mechanisms. So they were aware of good practice. So why they would choose to just kind of throw away something that was already there rather than even negotiate it? Because the design committee had, they had already accepted going in that they might not be able to get the exact mechanism that they draft, that it would be a process of negotiation and compromise. And why that happened, I'll skip a couple slides. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of the question for me. So I struggled with that. And I wanted to understand sort of what was behind what is it a difficulty with sort of getting out of that way of thinking of we're the decision makers, we're the benevolent providers of remedy. Did they not want to give up that power? Was it because of, was it an epistemic injustice issue? Was it because of prejudices against community members that they didn't think that they were capable of creating something? I don't really know. I mean, these are some of kind of my thoughts on it. But I would just to go, I don't know how to go backward. No, wait.
The other direction.
Oh, there, I see it now, sorry. Yeah, I mean, just to say though, that as difficult as that was and as sort of big of a hurdle that is, it's not final. So after all this happened, the design committee wrote a letter and then put it on the Business and Human Resource Center's website as well, sort of talking about their disappointment and still trying to negotiate. So some of this emerging discourse, we talked earlier about the language starting to change. People talk about co-design. They're also talking about redesign so that there's space to fix a bad mechanism. So that's something, I mean, at least until kind of COVID and the coup, that the communities were working on much stronger then. So it's not over yet. There is still a chance that at least, some of the priorities could get into the TILOA mechanism. And I think sort of the interplay between how their advocacy influenced good practice, so that now we have the OHCHR report, we have the ICJ report, there's new language in the UNGP's 10+ guidance about rights holder involvement, that maybe that can then be used as leverage to help the TILOA community. At least that's my hope. Yeah, so I don't want to be too, it's not the end yet. Yeah. So yeah, those are my reflections. So yeah, just to kind of wrap up and then kind of getting on the transition into how this overlaps with some of the work that I'm doing as a scholar, is that I think that if we think about power and epistemic injustice, this will help us to make sure that this new language is actually applied in a rights respecting way, things like co-design and rights holder centrality, and that we can avoid, or at least we can identify what happened in situations like Theodore, like why did they decide to do that? Where were they exercising power? Where was it coming from? So I think because like power, the idea of power in this context is not new anyway. I think it's generally accepted that power imbalances is a barrier to remedy. So we talk about the imbalances of power, less so about how people exercise power, how it manifests. Although they talk about it in ways like using leverage, which is in a sense using power. And then similarly, this idea of epistemic injustice, this helps us to kind of think about what has been taken for granted. What are the assumptions, and how have these assumptions in discourses been created through a process of marginalization? Like we treat things as, this is the way things are, this is the way they should be done, but that doesn't come out of the sky. That comes out of social practices, and who's involved in them and who's excluded from them. So I think looking at that in this context, and in some of the like additional readings that I thought, in case you got so excited about all of this, they talk about where this shows up in different contexts. I think there's a really good piece on Indigenous involvement in climate mitigation, and sort of how epistemic injustice, how they suffered that, and then also the material impacts of that on everybody. And I think this is important also because, to your point about like not blaming everything on company actions, although I do think they deserve a lot of the blame. But it's not as simple, but it's more complex. Like you said, there are practices by so many different actors within embedded systems that, that sometimes people are actively doing bad. Sometimes they're just, in epistemic injustice language, it's a willful ignorance that they just are not kind of willing or able to expand their ideas around what should be done and how it can be done, things like that. And that's important to think about, like, this last point I put, and that's something that I include in my ethics chapter, that it's not only bad practices of companies that we're talking about in this context, it's all of us. Like, we have to be reflecting on all of our own practices, which may be perpetuating these. So I'm sorry that this last bit I could sort of just rush through, but I wanted to make sure to have enough time to get through the rest of the questions.
Thank you.
So thank you. Feel free to email if you want to ask a question, argue, whatever.